Good evening. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Hello. As many of you know, my name is Sadie Thayer. I'm the director of our museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture. Before we get started, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. Since we are presenting this lecture on the historic homelands of the Kittitas and the Pishwanapan peoples, the bands of indigenous peoples, and that these bands are now recognized as part of the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation, a federally recognized Native nation constituted under the treaty with the Yakamas of 1855. The indigenous stewards of this land practiced a subsistence lifestyle through fishing, hunting, and gathering since time immemorial, and remain committed stewards to this land, cherishing, protecting, and using it as instructed by their elders through generations, and are actively practicing traditions and culture as neighbors in the Ellensburg community today. We are especially thankful to the Kittitas and the Pishwanapan peoples who have allowed us to learn from and share their stories and traditions with visitors from all across the world, as we serve as cultural custodians of their basketry, beadwork, and other items. I would like to also thank our membership for making tonight's presentation possible. Membership dues go to fund presentations like tonight's event, as well as take care and support our collections, events, activities, and so much more. So if you're a member, I especially want to thank you for your support. If you're not a member yet, please consider becoming a member, because it's that support that makes events like this so possible. After tonight's program, we're going to ask that you fill out a small survey so that we and the presenter can get feedback. It's important to have this information so we can continue to provide you a great lecture series. Our presenter tonight is Dave Benscoter. Dave grew up in Pullman and graduated from Wazoo. He spent 24 years in law enforcement with the FBI and the IRS. He worked in Seattle, North Carolina, Chicago, and Spokane. Following his retirement, he stumbled upon the fact that apples, believed to be extinct, were actually growing in Eastern Washington. This led to his personal search for the lost apples, and later the creation of the Lost Apple Project that searches for apples believed extinct in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. So far, this project has actually rediscovered 29 different varieties that have been extinct or lost. Dave has quite a bit to share about apples and their history in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm thrilled that he's here with us tonight so you can find out more about this history and more. So please join me in welcoming Dave Benscoter.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I actually have you guys think you're coming to learn something from me, but actually I'm coming here so I can learn something from you. And coming around is a little tablet, and if you put your name and email address on that, we will send you a newsletter every year to let you know what we are up to, what successes and other things that we've done. And also what I'm hoping is that some of you will have old apple trees that you either have in your on your property, or maybe a relative or a friend has old apple trees. And please send me an email and let me know. I've got cards down here. I hope I have enough cards, but please, that's why I come to these places, to find out about other trees that we can find out if they're lost varieties. First, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. I'm, oh, I just turned something off. There we go. Yeah, I started out in law enforcement, and after retiring in about 2006, I guess it was, I was doing a little chores for a former missionary who lived near me, and she was disabled. She is disabled, and one day as I was doing some stuff, she asked me if I could also go pick some apples in her orchard, and I said sure. I knew that she lived on her family's farm, and I knew it was sometime around 1915 when her grandfather purchased the property, and the orchard was on a little hill nearby, about 300 yards from the house. And so I grabbed a bucket, I grabbed a ladder, took off to the orchard, came back about 10 minutes later, and I said, I can't pick a single apple. These trees haven't been pruned in who knows how long. And all the apples were way too high for even a ladder to reach. So I said, luckily I know how to prune an apple tree. My dad had taught me how to prune, and I always had at least one apple in my yard wherever I lived. And so I'll come back next spring, I said, and I'll prune your trees. So it'll probably take about 2 or 3 years until you get some to eat, but we'll get them down, and that'll be our plan going forward. Well, that winter I started thinking about those apples, and I knew they're not going to be what I ate, the Honey Crisp and Galas and things like that. So I called her and I said, do you know what it was growing in that orchard? She could recall the top level was yellow transparent. That's an old Russian apple that actually made it to the United States in the 1800s. But she didn't know any of the other ones. And so she called her brother, and he let me know that there was a row of wealthy apples. And I knew that one to be an old variety, but they didn't have any idea what the rest of it was. And I made the huge mistake of going on the internet and finding out, start scrolling through the history of growing apples in Eastern Washington. Everybody knows you grow apples in Wenatchee and Yakima, but Eastern Washington in the early 1900s was just fanatical apple growing. At one time, and just in the Spokane Valley, there were over 1 million apple trees growing. Okay, I'm going to kind of go through this. This is that orchard that I spoke of. It was on a hillside. Actually, their well is in this orchard, so there's moisture under the ground, and the trees are healthy to this day. I'm showing you wheat seeds. If you happen to be a farmer, you know that if you go out and you plant wheat in the ground, what's going to happen? It's going to grow wheat, and you're going to harvest it the next year. Well, apples are different. Apples, when you plant their seeds, every seed will turn into a 100% unique apple tree. It's what it is. It's combining. Let's say you have a mother tree. Okay, maybe a Gold Delicious, and a bee comes over here. This is birds and bees, if you don't recognize this. A bee comes over here on a yellow, a yellow Delicious, and comes over to the red Delicious and pollinates. Their DNA combines, and that DNA, just like humans, you get a 100% unique apple tree out of that. And most of the time, some people will quote you up to 98% of the time, the apple will be totally inedible. They're called spitters. You'll just want to spit them out of your mouth. You'd think a red Delicious, a yellow Delicious, or a Honey Crisp, and anything would taste good, but that's really not the way it works. So so pilgrims, when they arrived, actually all the European immigrants that came from Europe came to America. We had no apple trees here other than crab apples. So any other apple tree had to be imported into the United States. Now, if you remember back in the 1500s, 1600s, about every 20 or 30 years, the plague was going through and just wiping out people. Well, if you take London, for example, all the sewage was going into the river. If somebody died of the plague, they throw them in the river. They throw their bedding in the river. People didn't have good, clean, fresh water. But they knew that people that drank cider didn't get sick. They knew nothing about bacteria. All they knew was if you don't drink the water, you don't get sick. So even young children, everybody, that's all they drank was hard cider. So you can imagine the cider orchards in Europe at that time, just millions of seeds because there was so little drinkable water. Even the children got little watered down versions of it. So when they came to America, it was their habit, it was their custom to have these cider orchards. I mean, we had beautiful, clean streams in America, yet they were planting millions and millions of seeds. And since every seed is different, I mean, you only need, like I said, you know, some people say 98%. Well, gee, that's still 2 apple trees that produce edible apples. So they started, if a neighbor had an apple that you liked, you'd probably say, well, hey, can I get a graft of that next year, a cutting, and I'll graft it on my tree. And then, so that's how apples would go from person to person. And they need a name for it because you didn't know what apple you were getting or where it came from. So it mean Dr. Brown's apple, or maybe it grew, the seedling grew next to a chimney. So it'd be the chimney apple. But after all this was done, there's now over 17,000 named varieties of apples in the United States and Canada. Most of those are going to be east of the Mississippi River, because that was where people first settled. And really in the early 1800s, people were kind of getting away from making cider. And of course, in the 1900s, early 1800s, Lewis and Clark came out and made their way to the West Coast. Okay, there's an old picture of making cider in the old days. Well, as I got interested in apples, I started reading books. This is one book, great book by Lee Calhoun. And in this book, the first half of the book concentrates on old apple trees, old southern apples, but the southern apples are often grown in the north that still exist today. While the second half of the book are lost southern apples. And that was the first time I realized there are such a thing as lost apples. And Lee Calhoun, one of the things he did was he looked for lost apples, and he recovered over 100 lost varieties. That's the east coast of the United States. And you can see John Bunker from Maine, Carlos Manning, West Virginia, Tom Burford, Virginia, Lee Calhoun, and Tom Brown from North Carolina. You know, it didn't take, well, I don't think it would take a brain surgeon. It certainly didn't take me long to figure out, I guess you can only look for lost apples on the East Coast, because that's where all the lost apples are being recovered. And I just kind of figure, well, I guess that's something that you can only do on the East Coast. Okay, this shows the Lewis and Clark expedition. Kind of shows you also the Louisiana Purchase was made in 1803. They made the expedition 1804 to 1806. United States then got the Spanish territory. They firmed up the border with Canada. So things were kind of, as we moved into the early 1800s, they were getting ready to start sending people out here to the west. There's kind of a rough draft or rough drawing of the Oregon Trail, the Whitman Mission. That's where Marcus Whitman was, and a couple of other missionaries and their families. And on their way to Oregon, they would go right by the mission. And so Marcus Whitman would be there to welcome them and send them on their way. The Oregon Trail started in 1840. 4 years before the trail opened up, Marcus Whitman opened his mission. A fellow by the name of Spalding also opened up a mission kind of near Lewiston, Idaho. And everybody came out the exact same way in wagons. Some of them had one wagon, some had 2 or 3 wagons, but everybody came by wagon. 1847, so just a few years after the Oregon Trail opens up, Henderson Llewellyn comes out to the West Coast. And the amazing thing about that is he was the first nurseryman to come out west. Now, before, when people came over from Europe and then let's see, Johnny Appleseed, when he went into the Ohio Valley, you hear stories about Johnny Appleseed. What was he doing? He was planting seeds. And so he was doing exactly what they did when they came into the United States. Coming out to the West was totally different. Now he's coming out here with grafted trees. And it changed everything. Just to show you where Walla Walla is, and down there, and that's really close to the Whitman Mission. Well, in November of 1847, Whitman was killed. There was a terrible disease that was going through both the white men and the Indians, and it was blamed on Marcus Whitman, and he and his family were killed in 1847. Henderson Llewellyn just stopped off and saw Marcus Whitman just a few months before he was killed. And Marcus Whitman tried to convince him to stay right there, but he said, no, I gotta go on to Oregon. So after this, obviously the Army came in and recognized that they had to deal with this issue. And Fort Walla Walla was built in 1856. And of course, there were fights with Indians. And finally, in 1858, the Army said, great, you can now come in and start homesteading. We've won the valley, we think it's safe. So in 1858, they say, come on in. Well, one of the first people to come in was Ransom Clark, and he was a nurseryman too. And he came out from Portland, and he had homesteaded some land very close to the fort. As a matter of fact, some of the trees that formed Fort Walla Walla came from the land that Ransom had. And he started building a cabin. He had brought a nursery stock with him, and he built the cabin about halfway through, and with his son, who I believe was about 13 years old. He hired a man to finish building the cabin, and Ransom headed back to Portland to get his wife, a young child, and a baby who was on the way. And that's the cabin that Ransom and his son and the other man built in 1859. But what happened was Ransom got back to Portland, and probably along the way he contracted pneumonia. And while he was back in Portland, he died suddenly. So now his wife, Lettice, she has her son who's 13 out in Walla Walla without anybody. She's got a child with her. She's got a baby on the way. Her parents tell her, well, obviously you're going to stay in Portland. You're not going to go to Walla Walla. That's ridiculous. She said, I'm going to go to Walla Walla. I'm going to check it out. So she came out, had to go by boat up the Columbia River, and then by stagecoach and wagon. She finally makes it to Walla Walla, where she now informs her son, who didn't even know his father had died. And she checked things out. She decided she's going to stay there. And she came back, or she went to Portland, had the baby, came back, and on her own, she's kind of a local hero. They've had wines named after her. They've plays done in Walla Walla, and she is truly amazing, a person, settler. And that's me. I have been transported back in time. No, that's not. That is the Ransom Clark cabin, and it's on the grounds of the Fort Walla Walla Museum in Walla Walla. And you can see they had, one side was the kitchen, and then the other side was where they slept at night. I guess that was for safety's sake. Okay, so here's Walla Walla. So when people were deciding where to live, so they're coming out on the Oregon Trail, and they've got to make a decision, where are we going to live? So they come out here, the Oregon Trail comes up here to Walla Walla. They can keep on going to Oregon, they can go back, kind of back north. You know, there's many directions, but the Palouse area, this which is now Whitman County, that started to become really popular because, first of all, everybody first wanted to be around Fort Walla Walla. The reason? They were safe. They had a fort right over their shoulder, so they didn't have to worry about Indian attacks. But you know, Walla Walla has only so much land, so finally people started moving up into the rich soils of Poland and Moscow and the Palouse. Okay, this is was a book that was written back in 1884, and it was actually for Nebraska homesteaders. But I just wanted to point out, this is a fellow by the name of John Yount wrote this paragraph, and there was another fellow who had basically exactly the same instructions for homesteaders. But what I wanted to really point out to you, that he would plant, he would plant 100 apple trees. Wow. And you think, well, you know, why would somebody need 100 apple trees? Well, here are some of the reasons. First of all, you can eat a fresh apple as early as July. They will keep in your cellar until April or May, depending on the variety. You can bake them, you can fry them, you can stew them, can them, dry them, sauce them. You can make hard cider, apple cider vinegar, which is good for preserving other foods. Apple butter. Apple butter was super important because, well, first of all, what apple butter is put a whole bunch of apples in a pot over a fire, and you just let them boil and boil and boil, and eventually all the moisture leaves, and what you're left with is a sugary glaze at the bottom of the pan. Well, when sugar is, you know, going for sky-high prices at your nearest general store, you make apple butter, and that's sugar. And finally, even disease fruit could be fed to the animals. But you know, back in the 1800s, we didn't have codling moth. We didn't have any of those insects. So basically, virtually all the fruit was great. Wouldn't that be nice to not have codling moth? Philip Ritz, he arrived in Walla Walla in 1861. He became the biggest nurseryman. That's only 3 years after Ransom Clark got there. But Ritz really, within 10 years, he had over 1 million trees in his nursery. This is a copy. This is a reproduction of his 1863 catalog. And it lists some apples there. Let's see. I always start with yellow transparent. That's the Russian apple, first one of the season. And then let's see. I can't remember if he carried any. Early on, he had a small catalog of apple trees. As they went along, he got more and more and more. Okay, this is WSU provided me with a copy of this. This is the same Ritz orchard, but this was a couple of years later, 1870s. And stained and all, that's kind of what it looks like. Okay, and there's this was a newspaper ad that ran in the Colfax paper. Colfax, Washington, which is like about 60 miles north of Walla Walla. And yeah, he had probably just ran the paper. He had over 1 million trees. And he sent trees as far away as Salt Lake City, Montana, places like that. Just to give you an idea of the population, 1870, Walla Walla, that was the place to be. 1880, still the place to be. 1890, Spokane takes huge leaps. The reason for that is the railroad came in. Railroad made it to Spokane in about 1883, and then started spreading out. Went south to Colfax, went to these other places. But the railroad is what really was a force pushing the population forward. Theophilus Smith, he was the first nurseryman in Colfax. And at first I was really concentrating on Whitman County. And the reason for that was that's where I found the most information. I found catalogs, nursery flyers, all sorts of information. You'd think, well, you know, Spokane, that's a pretty big county, should have a lot of information. Hardly any. Other counties around there, hardly any. Whitman County, just catalogs and nursery flyers. It's been really great. From those catalogs, and I found over 200, probably about 250 apple varieties that were being grown by nurserymen. Later on, I'll tell you a little bit about WSU, but including WSU in that number, there were over 600 apple varieties growing in eastern Washington and northern Idaho. Theophilus Smith was the first nurseryman. He put this ad in the paper. He came in 1872, but I think the paper didn't run until about 1877. This is Theophilus Smith's property there. So this is Colfax. You just take a little road up the hill and there's Theophilus Smith's nursery. And this is a flyer from his nursery. And at that time, he was carrying 2 lost apple varieties, the Walbridge, and this says Islam Sweet. Apples often got misspelled. It's actually Isham Sweet. But just from that list, I know that he carried 2 lost varieties. George Rudy, he was, of all the nurserymen, was the most interesting. He cooperated with universities all over the nation. He sent samples of plums, samples of apples, little trees to other universities and nurseries around the country. Unfortunately, I don't have a catalog from George Rudy's nursery, but this is the only thing I ever found with a list of his apples. He ran this ad in the Colfax Gazette, and I think there's probably about 20 apples there, but some really unusual apple. I know he was experimenting with Russian apples and then also apples from Hungary. And down here you'll see there's St. Petersburg. That sounds like Russian. Peter the Great, that sounds very Russian. Anyway, so there he is. If you guys ever spot him, let me know. That's the only known picture of George. And here's an ad that George ran in the Colfax Gazette. Okay, this is called the Hanford House or the Hanford Castle. Oakdale is located about halfway between, well, not quite halfway, about a third of the way from Colfax to Spokane. It's located near Steptoe Butte, and a fellow by the name of Hanford, Edward Hanford, came from the east. He had a pocket full of money, and he came out and he saw Oakdale, and he said, Oakdale, that is going to be the next Spokane. And he was wrong. And he built this. This is an 8,000 square foot house. I've been in it. You can play basketball in the attic. They had a little separate staircase for their servants. It's just an amazing house. At one time it was a bed and breakfast, but it's no longer being used for that. Okay, this is a Hanford nursery flyer. One of the Hanford kids, or great grandkids, gave me this flyer, and then I got some other stuff from them. But okay, so here from this, just this flyer, Iser Spitzenberg lost. Piles Red Winter and Babbitt both lost. Cornell Fancy, Charlatan, Nero, Dickinson, Scarlet Cranberry, all lost varieties. I want to point out one other apple here, John Apple. The John Apple was actually introduced by the Hanford Nursery. The relative who gave me this said that somebody came in with this apple and said, hey, what do you think of this apple? And he said, I think it's a great apple. And I don't know if money was exchanged at that time or not, probably, but he started to carry that apple in his nursery. And he decided to name it after his youngest son, John. Okay, that's going to become important later on. Okay, and it says here, this, I know you can't read this. It says the above list of trees is the choice of our 145 different kinds fruited. Okay, so this is only about 60. So now we know that actually he's got 145. Okay, and there's a picture of Edward Hanford checking his seedlings. And what he would do is, I think it's the next picture. Okay, so what he'd do, Edwin had this little machine, and one of the books that I was given was kind of a receipt book for Edwin, and had letters and things like that. Edwin had a machine called the Planet Junior seed planter, and had 2 handles on it. one wheel, and then on top of it, it had a little container. You'd pour your apple seeds into that, and then you'd set the dials that were on the little the planter, and you could like drop four seeds every foot, or 2 seeds every 18 inches. And so, and that's how he got those apples planted, or apple seedlings planted out there. Okay, in 1906 or 7, Hanford sold his nursery to the Vinland Nursery Company of Clarkston, Washington. And there's documentation about that. So I started looking at the varieties. I knew that Hanford had 145 varieties, but I was wondering, okay, does the Vinland Nursery, did they pick up all those varieties from Hanford? Or are we talking just totally different businesses? Well, this is a page from the catalog, and sure enough, they're carrying the John apple. So that told me that they're basically carrying the entire catalog of apples that were offered by the Vinland Nursery. And so this was in Clarkston, Washington. Clarkston's right next to Lewiston. So that's about 60 miles, 50 miles from Oakdale, but south. And so we've been looking in Idaho, we've been looking in Southeast Washington. I'll continue, I'll spoil. Okay, this is another a document from that letters book. I found out that they were carrying a lost apple called Early Colton, one called the Enormous Pippin. That's easy to see, isn't it? Yeah, that's it. And one called the Isham Sweet. And that is what the backside of the Hanford Castle looks like. Like many of the hills in the Palouse, sometimes those hills are not just, rolling like that. Sometimes they'll come up and they just cut off the back. Well, that's not farmable land back there. So what farmers would do is they plant a green belt behind whenever they have a hill like that. That's what Hanford did. And actually there's still apples and pears and plums in those. One apple tree we're still looking at, but that's what it looks like from behind. Okay, what really grabbed me, I was just doing some research on George Rudy. I thought he was a fascinating person because he just did so many things. And I opened up a newspaper, and the newspaper, it was an old Colfax Gazette from the early 1900s. It had a little article about George Rudy. And that was pretty cool. And I just happened to notice this headline where it said, it was the Colfax Gazette that said premiums for the county fair. I thought, well, shoot, I don't know. The only thing I ever sent to the county fair was when I was about 11 or 12 years old, and I sent in a sunflower. And I thought, well, I wonder if, how they do that. And so I started reading the article, and I realized, I looked here's C.F. Hornby, but he had 5 plates of winter apples. He got first. Then I started looking down here, and I recognized some names like Baldwin. I knew that was an apple. And let's see, Northwest Green. I thought I had heard that. And then I realized some of the names I didn't know. So I started writing down the names of apples I didn't know. And then I went back to Lee Calhoun's book. And I'm going through Calhoun's book in the lost apple section. And sure enough, there's some apples that were growing in Whitman County. Matter of fact, Fred Huffman is the only one who submitted apples to the county fair, and he had 2 lost varieties. He submitted the Walbridge, and he also submitted the Langford. Well, that kind of got my attention. And so I thought, gosh, I'm the only person that knows the lost apples were growing in Whitman County. It's like, what do I do? And I knew that there was a couple people that worked for the volunteers for the Home Orchard Society down in Portland. So I emailed them or called them up. And I said, do you mind if I send you a few bags of apples? Because what I was thinking was, the Walbridge is the most unique apple. The Walbridge has a second name. It's called the Edgar Red Streak. And what was unique about it was a solid red apple, but it had these streaks of burgundy on it. And this is a watercolor painting. We'll get back to that in a minute. But And there's like about 6 watercolor paintings of a wall bridge. And they all look pretty much the same. Red apple, dark burgundy streaks. Okay, now these paintings, the United States government did something amazing in about 1880. What they did was, of course, we didn't have color photography back then. They commissioned with about 20 watercolor artists to paint fruits and nuts. And out of that, we have, I believe, about 4,000 paintings of apples. If we did not have those, it would be very hard. I mean, I don't identify apples anyway. I have to send them off, but I can't imagine trying to identify an apple without a watercolor. Anyway, so I found a whole bunch of bags, or I started going around Colfax and around Whitman County, and I would see an old tree and I'd stop and I'd ask people if I could, pick their apple tree, and everybody said, yeah, sure. I finally had, I think it was 3 or 4 bags of apples. They all looked like they could be the Walbridge, red with red streaks on them. I was ready to send in these apples in a box, and I just happened to go by this water pump station in Colfax. And leaning over the water pump station was this apple tree with these big orange apples. And I thought, those are the weirdest looking apples I've ever seen. They got corners on them. And so when I said to the folks who were going to do my identification, I said, I'm sending in these bags of Walbridge, and I'm sending in this other apple that doesn't look like anything I've ever seen. Well, they got back to me and they said, that is the fall geneting. And I said, what's a fall geneting? And so I had to look it up, and then I didn't see it on anybody's nursery. I started contacting nurseries around the country. I started contacting other apple explorers, and finally I thought, I think I've actually found a lost apple. And then remember John Bunker? He was on that map on the East Coast. He lived up in Maine. Thought, I haven't talked to John. I better call him. So I sent an email off to John, and he emailed me back and he said, I found a fall geneting just last year. Well, it broke my heart a little bit, but I only had the only second known fall geneting to ever survive. And so that did boost me. And I thought, maybe we can really do this. It's a beautiful apple. It also tastes really good, but it doesn't have, when you bite into a Honeycrisp, and it gets that really crisp snap, doesn't have it. You just sink your teeth in, and it's very solid and good taste. It actually is written about it that it's the best canning apple ever. Although I cannot imagine putting that on one of those old old peelers, you just skip and skip and skip. That's a watercolor painting of the fall geneting. Yeah. And that was from, I think that was, I'm not sure. Yeah, it looked like 87, but I'm not positive. Okay, where I found the fall geneting was right there in Colfax. And what makes that significant is that this was the old Colfax College. Theophilus Smith, that nurseryman, the first nurseryman in town, he was instrumental in getting the Colfax College built. He was a Baptist, and he and some others got the Colfax College built, and so he could have planted that apple, I don't know. And then F.N. English, he was a teacher and the president of the college. He actually submitted apples, not the fall geneting, but other apples to the county fair. So he could have been the one that planted it. Either way, when they identified it, I grafted it. You can see this is the graft there. Okay, so this is actually golden delicious, and then on top of that, graft on the fall geneting. So every other apple on the branch as it grows is going to be a fall geneting. Okay, Steptoe Butte. I did one kind of a presentation like this at Steptoe Butte, or excuse me, in Oakdale, which is located about 8 miles north of Steptoe Butte. And people had told me there's a whole bunch of orchards on Steptoe Butte. And I said, great, I'll have this presentation. Everybody's going to come and tell me where all these orchards are and who planted them. So I did the presentation, and I'm getting near the end of the presentation. And of course, the age group in at the presentation. I'd say the average age was over 80. I figured, sweet, these people are gonna know everything. And so I said, okay, who can tell me about the orchards on Steptoe Butte? And there was complete silence. And I was like, I can't believe it. Nobody knows where these orchards came from. And they were families that had been there for over 100 years. Well, after the presentation, a lady came up to me and she said, you know, when I was a young child, she was over 8, my brother and I lived in a house with mom and dad on the west side of the butte, which would have been over kind of that direction. And she said, we would go up to the butte and pick apples. And she said, if you want to, I can show you where the orchards are. I said, great. Well, the first one was very easy to see because you go through it as you enter the park. It's a picnic area. But that's all the information I had about the orchard. I want to show you where it's right. So there's Palouse. Oh, wait. That's Palouse. Okay, Colfax. So Steptoe Butte is right about there, and Oakdale is just north of it. Okay. So one of the first things I did was I went and got a plat map. For Whitman County, they had a plat map for 1895 and 1910, and that was it as far as early plat maps. So I found out this is Steptoe Butte. They had a little kind of curlicue. It says Steptoe Butte. 3/4 of the butte was owned by a fellow named James Davis. His nickname was Cashup Davis. He later built a hotel on top of Steptoe Butte. I don't know if you've heard that. Growing up in Whitman County, I learned about that, but it seems like nobody outside of the county knows that. And then on the other 4th of Steptoe Butte is a section 160 acres. It's not square. It's kind of like a boot. And that's R.E. Burns, Robert E. Burns. Okay, so the next step, shows the Burns homestead. The next step is, I'm sure your favorite website, as it is mine, findagrave.com. And I went to findagrave.com, and oh my goodness, there was a relative that wrote all about Robert Burns and his family. And so I contacted her. She sent me a family history about, I don't know, about 40 pages. And I found out how these orchards got on Steptoe Butte. And you can see that, okay, that's the Burns homestead. And today, I think that probably the farming is pretty much what it was back then, which is, I mean, that's not even a quarter of the 160 acres was farmed. And he married Macy in 1888. Her dad, her name was Macy Hume. Her dad's name, of course, Mr. Hume. His farm was located right down here. And the name of the road, you come in it goes by Steptoe Butte, it's called Hume Road. Okay, so I think what happened was, 1880, that's really late for getting prime Palouse dirt. You know, the guys that get there first get the best land. And in 1888, wanting to be close to daddy and having prime real estate, you're not going to do it. So he had to get this land. This is going up the butte. It's too steep for farm equipment. That's why you see so much of this still not being farmed today. It's just way too steep. And that's Robert. I do not think Robert weighed 140 pounds. So he married in 1888. This was taken in 1905. He had, help me out here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 kids by 1905. Okay, he ended up with, I think, 11 or 12. Okay, but what I mainly want to show you is Robert Burns was so slight in frame. His dad was a cancer doctor in Cheney. He was not cut out to be a farmer. You can imagine that farmland, they were pulling out, probably most of that was covered in pine trees, and they were going to have to pull those out, burn them, maybe use them for their house. But that was a lot of work just to get some soil they could plant some wheat on. Okay, so in He marries Macy in 1888. In 1893, there's a catastrophe. And the catastrophe has been documented. And in just this area of Whitman County, there were fall rains that came in. And it rained on the wheat crop and continued to rain. And the farmers in this part of the county never got their crop out of the field. Well, Robert, of course, he had 9 kids by 1905. He probably had at least 3 or 4 kids by 1893. And he was in trouble. That was his only income, being a wheat farmer. So what Robert did, he decided it was probably a smart move, considering everything. He decided to diversify. And there was just in Elberton, which was like 5-7 miles away, was the quote world's biggest prune dryer. So he bought prune trees, he bought plum trees, he bought pear trees, and most of all, he bought apple trees. And he planted them on his property, hoping that he was going to be able to overcome it. He had no money, so he borrowed money to do it. But by 1899, he ran out of time. He didn't have the money. He had to sell the farm. And this document that was filed with the county says that Robert sold the farm for $1, and the person that bought the farm had to take over his payments. But what he left on the butte was, I figure, possibly up to 450 apple trees on his property. And okay, now we'll look at James Davis. Okay, James Davis came from back east also. He came a lot later on in life, though. I think he was about 50 years old when he reached Whitman County. He was a big thing back then. He had a stagecoach stop right at the bottom of Steptoe Butte. He had a saloon and a dance hall and a general store and a livery. He had everything there. And then 1893, the trains come, and that's the end of the stagecoach business. And so he had no business anymore. And so he decided he would build a hotel on top of Steptoe Butte. But in the meantime, on the ravines coming off of Steptoe Butte, just like Robert Burns, he started planting apple trees, pear trees, plum trees, and I believe there's probably about 250 apple trees still today in the ravines that come off Steptoe Butte. There's an artist's drawing of what the James Davis Steptoe station, stagecoach station looks like, 1875. Okay, that's the hotel. It was super popular for about 2 years. I don't know if you've ever been to Steptoe Butte, but it's basically rock, and he had to build into over 1,000 feet above the land. He had to basically hire guys to make a road, and I can't even imagine going up that thing on a carriage or a wagon. I mean, you would just be looking over the edge, and have your life, and you just think you're going to die. Well, it was a big deal when it opened. And then people thought, it's too much, and so he went bankrupt. And okay, I'm going to move on now. Okay, I wanted to show this James Davis. Okay, here's James Davis's name, and I'll read this. It says it's an advertisement for Theophilus Smith, first nurseryman in Colfax. Came out in 1890. I think he was had a little bit of a running battle with George Rudy about who's going to be the best nurseryman in Colfax. And so he says, the only collection of hardy trees that have been proven in the Palouse country, Cashup Davis, ever ready to show you wonders from Steptoe Butte, says, my trees are the only one he has had that were worth a blank, blank, blank. Oh, I've never seen an ad like that today. The rest have become black-hearted. Okay. So he was there's Cassius. He had 7 sons, 3 daughters, 20 grandchildren. I do not believe Cassius planted a single tree on Steptoe Butte. I think it was all his sons and grandchildren that planted those trees. But many of them are still alive today. This is the first lost apple that we recovered. This was in 2014, and it was just as you come into the park, really nice little apple called the Nero. and watercolor painting. There's a couple watercolor paintings. Dickinson, we found in 2016. 2016 was a good year. Yep, found the Arkansas Beauty. That was actually on Cashup Davis land. And the Dickinson was on Robert Burns' land. And trust me, I didn't just stay on Step of View. Shackelford found out about 2 miles from where I live. That's in excuse me. I live up above Spokane. Okay, McAfee, that was again on Robert Burns' land. Ewald, that was found near Post Falls. Kittitas, that was found in southern Idaho. We now have about 20 members of the Lost Apple Project committee members, and about half our members are in southern Idaho. And back in 2017, one of our members, George Reno, found this little apple near Boise, and it is the Kittitas, and it is a wonderful small apple. Flushing Spitzenberg, that was kind of in the Post Falls area. Autumn Gray near Waitsburg. Surprise number 1, that was near Dayton. And the surprise is when you bite it, because I saw this apple and I didn't think it was, it didn't look like much, and bit into it and then looked at the flesh and I was like, yeah, surprise. And cool thing was, we tried to establish that every variety was actually growing in that part of the country. And for years, I had no proof of surprise growing in the county, but just within the last year, I found a nursery catalog that had surprise in it. Sari Sinek, that was found near Troy, Idaho. Mallard near Troy. Jackson Sweet, that was near Waitsburg. Excelsior in Moscow. Waitsburg near Pullman. This is actually one of those trees that George Rudy and WSU were testing. It was a Hungarian tree, Mialofi. Clarabelle, it was near Genesee. Pullman near Troy. Fink in southern Idaho. Goldridge in near Pomeroy. Buttersweet of Pennsylvania, that was near Genesee. And okay, that was a K apple found. And this apple, it's funny, this apple was actually sent from Lewiston, Idaho. And we found that apple about 40 miles from Lewiston south as you head into Oregon, which is near Florida, the town of Flora, Oregon. I know. I was going to tell you, I can't remember what I should. Okay, let's see. I wanted to tell you also that there were other companies from nursery companies from Oregon coming into Lewiston. And so while I thought, the Vinland nursery is probably the only one supplying people with apples because I hadn't found anything. Well, I started finding ads, and actually a fellow, a historian who's written a lot of books. His name is Stephen Branting. Has written a ton of books on Lewiston history, and he alerted me to a couple of newspaper articles. And the newspaper articles were about Oregon nurseries, kind of close to where Henderson Llewellyn was, coming in. And basically, 1907, the Model T was not made until 1907. So these guys were coming out on wagons, they were coming out on horseback. They would go farm to farm. They'd carry a big catalog and get orders for trees. And there was an ad for one. There's an Oregon nursery company that was in a paper called the Lewiston Teller. There's the Oregon Nursery Company. Their apples, and then another one that was the Lansing Nursery, also called the Quaker Nursery. Talking about representatives coming in. That's what their catalog looked like. This is me. This is what I do out in the field. Okay, so someone calls me or emails me and says, I've got apples. I've got an old homestead orchard. If it's within driving distance and some trees on it, I go out and I hope you can all see I had help on this one here over here. And we had an agreement. He would stick to his he would eat his apples and I would do my business over here, and we got along fine. He just would check on me every once in a while, and I'd check on him every once in a while. First thing I do when I go into an orchard is I take a piece of paper and I start making circles for trees, giving each tree GPS coordinates, and then I estimate the time of ripeness. So if, let's say, that tree right next to me was ripe right then, I was there on September 15th, and I write September 15th. It was really green and wasn't going to be ripe for a month or so. I might put, October 20th or something like that. And you might be wondering, how come? Why is that tree? It looks kind of small for most 100-year-old trees. That is pretty small. However, this is in an area, it's actually close to Coeur d'Alene Lake. And the pine trees have grown so tall in there, these trees cannot get light. And so the owners have been really good about clearing out pine trees. You can see some trees on the ground there, but they have struggled for 100 years to get light. But obviously the moose is happy with the results. Okay, this is one. I wanted to show you. This is what I do after I bag the apples. I want to get 7 or 8 of each from each tree that I'm interested in. Put them in a bag. I put the GPS coordinates on there, the day I picked them, and location, and then I take a picture of them. So that way, if I get a call from our apple identification experts, they say, this is the apple, it's a lost one, we need you to go back and get grafting wood, I'll have the exact coordinates to go back to. And I'll have my little map. This is what it looks like when, just before I put them in a box and mail them off to our experts. You saw the meala feed earlier? That's what Sean is eating right there. He's one of our apple identification experts. This is not something you go to school to learn. This is a skill that's passed down from generation to generation. When Sean and Joni go away, I do not know what we're going to do. There's only 5 people that do this in the United States right now, and I think 3 of them are over 80. Okay, Olmsted State Park. Well, who's been home? Olmsted? Hopefully everybody. You should all be going to Olmsted Historical State Park. And right next to this old tree, it says Russian Harvest Apple Tree. And so I did my research. And actually, I mentioned the yellow transparent came into the United States in the early 1800s. Well, about 1870, there was another influx of Russian trees. And that was like, oh man, I really kind of forget right now, but I want to say like 200 different Russian varieties were shipped to the United States for testing. And if you, there's actually U.S. Department of Agriculture little pamphlets on it, probably a 100-page pamphlet describing the apple. Well, it doesn't really describe the apple. It gives their name and the Russian name and then their American name they gave the apple. And for some reason, some of the names they gave them are ridiculous. One of them is the turnip apple. I mean, who would want to eat a turnip apple? Well, I looked through everything. I could not find a Russian harvest apple tree. So I'm hoping to someday learn the history on that. But now we're also doing DNA testing now. I don't know if I'm going to go into that in detail. So I'll just say that these are some of the members of our project in the Palouse countries. That day we were potting apple trees to sell and to support our project. And this is our mission, our goals. We seek to identify and map apple trees and orchards planted prior to 1920. 1920 was kind of the date where nurseries stopped carrying a lot of apples. Let me see. Oh, I didn't have a but. I found kind of a smoking gun in one of the nurserymen's magazines, and they said, and this was in 1918, and they said to the other nurserymen, you need to stop selling these apples. They're not profitable. Don't carry them in your nursery anymore. And listed about 70, 80 apples. And they didn't know back then, but a lot of those apples have now become extinct. But anyway, questions? Yes.
The first thing I'm wondering is how likely is it in math terms that we'll someday find apple trees on another planet growing line?
You know, that's a good question, but I don't think I'm the one to answer that.
Okay.
I think we're going to the moon pretty soon, so maybe they could take some apple seeds up there. Anyone else have a question? Okay, now I want to make each of you, I need to deputize each one of you and go out and find me apples. Okay, find apple trees. I've got business cards down here, and please, this is how we find these old trees. People contact us. We go out to orchards, or they send us apples. And to tell you the truth, Ellensburg is too far away from a day trip, and basically I go as far as I can drive and then back. And if I'm going to a bunch of orchards, Ellensburg is just kind of too far. So I'm going to rely on people to send me apples, and what I'm looking for are good tasting apples, because the pioneers did not plant bad tasting apples. If you find a bad tasting apple, that's going to be a seedling. And bears and coyotes and every kind of animal you can think of eats apples and spreads those seeds everywhere. But if you find a really good tasting variety, you can pretty much bet that was somebody planted it. And if there's no sign of a homestead there and you find apple trees, well, trust me, it was there, because somebody planted those apple trees when they first came to this part of the country.
So when did they start grafting apples? It was much earlier, I think, than I thought.
Yeah, there are Roman books that the Romans did some grafting, and it could be even before that. But yes.
Maybe a dumb question, but when you said that each individual apple tree is unique because of the pollen coming from others, so how do these stay unique for centuries?
Well, and I'm kind of making it kind of simple. Bees collect the pollen, but they're also when they come to the mother plant, it's combining the DNA of both the mother tree and the father tree, and it's just it's kind of like humans. We have just I don't know, millions and millions of different cells. Somebody turns out to be bald, and somebody turns out to have a head of hair, and that's the way the apples are too. It's just every single one is unique, and will be a different flavor you've never tasted before. Usually bad. Yes.
If that's the case, then why are the apples on the tree all the same?
Oh, no, that's what, okay, so you get your rootstock. So, and today, what most of the commercial orchards are doing today, they're getting the dwarf trees that will not get any taller than about 8 feet tall. What they do is they'll order, and usually there's a company that will do this for them, but they'll say, we want 1,000 trees on, and then it's the rootstock M7. Okay, and the rootstock is usually numbers and letters. M7 is kind of a short rootstock. It's actually bigger than 8 feet, but and so what these companies will do is they'll grow the rootstock, and then they'll have the graft cuttings of what they want. So a cosmic crisp. They'll have branches of cosmic crisp, and they'll graft that to the rootstock. And wherever they make that graft, from then on up, it's going to be cosmic crisp. But the roots tell the plant how big to get, or the tree how big to get. So if it's on dwarfing rootstock, the tree will never get over 9 feet high or so. But that also is the reason that you see in these new commercial orchards, they've got these trees on a wire. They have a post on one end, they have a post on the other end, they run a wire between them, and they tie the tree to those. And the reason for that is the root ball on those trees is only going to be about this big. Never will get any bigger than that. And once those apples start to mature, that tree would just go falling over. And so to keep them up, they have them on the wires. And they've got them all watered. Each one has a little water to it. And there's many reasons, they're going to this, but the roots tell the tree how big to get.
So if I have an apple crisp tree, the apples on it are all the same, but
Yes, the apples will all be the same on the tree unless you do like me and I graft to different branches.
something else.
Yeah, because matter of fact, one of the trees in Colfax that I went by, it's got a gold on one side and it's got a red on the other side. And somebody 100 years ago was fooling around and grafting.
So the crossing will affect the seed, not the apple.
Sorry, who's that? Oh,
The question is, the apples are all the same on the tree,
yes,
but if there's cross pollination, that shows up in the seed.
exactly,
not in the apple.
exactly. It shows up in the seed, not in the apple.
How many parents can an apple tree have? So that
Just two.
just.
Just two, and yeah, we have added DNA testing to our identification process. And I was a total newcomer at this 2 years ago, and so I'll just try to explain this really simply. So if we find an apple that is a likely lost apple, we will send it into WSU where they will do a test on it, and then they'll come back with us and tell us they've got a database of about 3,000 apples in the database. So all the new varieties, Cosmic Crisp, Honeycrisp, Galas, all these, they're going to automatically be in that database. They're very popular. But a lot of old apples are going to be in that database too. So let's say I send an apple in and they say, yes, it matches, it is a yellow bellflower. Well, from that point on, I don't have to worry about that apple anymore. It has been identified. It's not a lost variety. So I don't have to send it in anymore. I don't have to bag it. I don't have to do anything. Now, let's say I send in another apple and they say, nope, we don't have it in our database. But we can tell you who the parents were. And the parents were Gold Delicious and Red Delicious. Well, that tells me I don't have to worry about that apple either, because I know who the parents are. Red Delicious came out in 1895 and Gold Delicious in 1915. Well, 1915, that was really close to where they weren't putting out any more new varieties. So I'm going to totally eliminate that apple from apples that I'm looking at. However, if the parents, and sometimes they're able to tell me one parent, and sometimes they're not. But even if they tell me, one parent, if the parent is from the, let's say the 1900s, I'm pretty much going to discard that. That's not going to be an apple we're going to look at. But yes. Any other? Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
If they can't identify it by DNA testing, so it would then have to turn around and go to the 5 people in the United
Yes.
States.
Yes.
What is the backlog for these people?
In the COVID year, we sent them about 300 bags of apples. It was too many. We found that, I could just tell kind of from talking to them in email, it was just way too many. A little over 200 is kind of what we shoot for now. So, and there's no average, there's no average in how long it takes to identify an apple. We can send one in and, they can see right away where we've seen that wine sap 1,000 times. So, boom, they know what it is. And then if it's a lost variety, that's when they really got to go dig deep. There's old 150, way over 100-year-old books. And actually they're available online because they're out of copyright. And they go through these books and there's descriptions of the apples. There's like 50 different characteristics of an apple. Everything from seed size to seed shape to how long the stem is. And they have to use all that when they're identifying a lost apple.
Dave, did you get an invitation from Dr. Steve Van Osdol
Yes,
to visit his property?
yes, and actually
I never heard how that turned out.
one of the lost apples came from his orchards, and we're still looking.
Garfield County?
Is that where? I know it's on with the border, Garfield and
And Whitman.
no, Garfield and what's the other county?
Columbia.
Columbia, yes,
Columbia,
Columbia.
yeah.
It's right on the border. But anyway, yes, the Gold Ridge was found on his property. The property we're talking about is a homestead at the basically a bottom of a canyon. You can only get to it with little four-wheelers, ATVs. And if there's snow on the ground, you can't get to it. Yes.
Why aren't all the varieties of edible apples sold in the grocery store? Or why isn't there a special US Apple store already that sells all those varieties?
You know, yeah, I think it would just, some of the apples I could tell would not do well in a supermarket.
Oh.
You know, some of the apples bruise easily. Some of them, I'll give you an example. Jackson Winter Sweet. That's as the name implies, that's a really sweet apple. And it's really too sweet. You know, it would do really well if you're making that apple butter. You know, it's going to have a lot of sugars in it. But for actually just, you know, taking it, to me, I like the apples that have a little bit of tart and a little bit of sweet. And but I'll tell you that Gold Ridge is it's a really good one. It's got tart, it's got sweet.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and gosh, and there's a couple others. I really think the Shackelford is probably the most commercial ready apple. It is large. It's tart and it's sweet. It holds up well to insect damage. You know, some apples, if you go out, you know, a field and pick an apple off a tree, it's just going to be mush because of the insect damage. The way the Shackelford responds to it is basically it doesn't. And so you'll see if there's been an insect, it'll drill a hole straight out of the apple, but the surrounding flesh will not be affected at all. And it's consistently large, and I'm told it keeps well. I've never had any in my refrigerator that's kept that long. So yes.
How can you purchase some of these lost apples that you found?
Yes, but we do local sales only. We can't ship out of state. So if you're in Spokane or Pullman, we sell there. And we also we have a Facebook page, the Lost Apple Project. And around January 1st of each year, we announce what trees we'll have for sale and also scion wood or grafting wood. And we sell a lot of grafting wood to people around the country that, you know, they can't come to get a tree and get the grafting wood to put on their own trees or they buy rootstock and make their own little trees. Yes.
Is there a place you can go to see all of these trees growing? And
You can come to my house.
you've got that big a place that you.
Actually, I only have I think I only got about 4 of these varieties on the trees, and everything else are branches. There's just too many. And I also grow branches of apples that I know we're growing in the county. And my hope is that eventually I'll be able to compare apples. So let's say I find one out and I'll say, man, I think that's on my tree, and I'll go out there. And then that's the other thing we're trying to do is make it so we have enough grafting wood so we don't have to go out in the field and get it. Like the place down by Pomeroy at the bottom of a canyon, I've made that a top priority to get that because I still had to go down into that canyon last February. And luckily we had a break in the weather and able to get down there. But that's the kind of apple I want on a tree right outside my back door. So I don't want to do that Well, thank you very much for allowing me to talk, and I expect lots of emails. My business cards are down here, and please help yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of history.
Thank you.
That's a little bit harder. I like it. Yeah.
Sure. I come down.
No, I go right, there's two.
But I'm